So what if I told you that without Luke Skywalker, Photoshop wouldn't exist? It's 1975 and George Lucas is working on a little new movie called Star Wars. This movie requires visual effects that Hollywood didn't know how to make. Things that were never been done before. So George Lucas founded the company Industrial Light and Magic, ILM for short. And by the way, today ILM still exists and it actually makes the visual effects for the biggest movies in the world. But back then, he put together a ragtag group of inexperienced but resourceful creatives in a warehouse in San Francisco and gave them just one task. Just go figure it out. And well, they did. They didn't just make the most successful movie franchise in history possible, but to do so, they had to invent new technologies, like the first motion-controlled camera. ILM was the best place in the world at using new technologies to make visuals. And working in a place like this is no coincidence that John Knoll, one of the guys working at ILM, in his spare time built Display, a way to handle grayscale images on a Macintosh Plus, together with his brother. They added more and more features to control images and display them and edit them, and they released their software naming it Image Pro. But in 1990, Image Pro gets bought by a small company that you may know, called Adobe. And there, they renamed Image Pro to, you guessed it, Photoshop. So yeah, without the galaxy's most famous kisser of his own sister, I probably wouldn't have to pay Adobe every single month. Behind the tech you use every single day, and that we all take for granted, there are incredible stories just like this one. I'm not gonna lie, some of them are weird, some are obscure and unknown, and some make you think, what the... And I promise you, after this video, you're gonna have to hold back from telling all of these to your friends. This video is sponsored by Vanta. More about them later. But let's start simple. So, you've played video games, right? Well, what do you think this is? It says Sony PlayStation, but it's clearly not a PlayStation. Actually, it has the same controller of a Super Nintendo, but with PlayStation on it. Well, this is a real console. A real console that Sony and Nintendo made together, but that was never released. And this is the story of the betrayal that gave birth to the console war between Nintendo and Sony, which still goes on to this day. In the early 90s, Nintendo wanted to add CD-ROM technology, which was new at the time, to their Super Nintendo console. And to do so, they partnered with Sony. Together, they developed a prototype simply called PlayStation. And remember, Sony wasn't in the video games market at this time. They were busy making Walkmans and TVs. So the PlayStation console is finally ready. And at CES, the Consumer Electronics Show in 1991, Sony proudly announces their partnership with Nintendo and showed off the console. And the next day, Nintendo had their announcement scheduled. We are proud to announce a new partnership to bring CDs to the Super Nintendo. A partnership with Philips. What? Sony was baffled. Nintendo secretly made a second partnership because they were worried about licensing agreements with Sony, effectively betraying them. But the engineer that led the PlayStation project at Sony, Ken Kutaragi, wasn't having it. He convinced Sony's CEO to take the PlayStation project and launch it as a Sony product. And in 1994, they launched the PlayStation. So if Nintendo didn't backstab Sony, their biggest competitor probably wouldn't exist. But stories are not just origin stories. Sometimes even the words and the names we use have a wild story behind them. And oh no, there's a bug. But wait, why is it called a bug? In 1947, engineers at Harvard were working on a Mark II Icon relay calculator, a very early computer. And it was behaving weirdly. So they inspected the computer and they found an actual moth stuck in there that was causing an electrical fault. And this was the very first computer bug, which was actually a real bug. And this is where the name comes from. But you know the friend that's always like,
bro, I was listening to a podcast and...
Podcast? What does podcast even mean? Well, what if I add this? You got it? Well, how about now? The word podcast means iPod broadcasting, and it was invented by a journalist from The Guardian and used to represent audio that you broadcast to your iPod. Apple just liked the word and adopted it when building podcasts into iTunes, and it stuck all the way to here. So maybe if the Microsoft Zune would have won against the iPod, we would call them Zunecasts? So we've already seen the weird connection between Luke Skywalker and Photoshop, but this is far from the only weird connection in tech. And, oh, sorry. I'm getting a phone call. But luckily I had vibration enabled, because the only reason why we're able to go out in public and not hear this is because your phone's vibration comes from a World War II plane? So back then, the controls the pilots were holding were very shaky. So devices were invented to reduce the rumble of the yoke when pilots were flying. But they soon discovered that it was actually useful to have the controls vibrate when the plane was about to stall. So they artificially rebuilt vibration into the controls to signal to the pilot that the plane was stalling, effectively inventing the first haptic system in history. Decades later, the video game industry took this tech and they had another idea. First in 1978, when Sega introduced the arcade game Motocross, the first one with haptic feedback on the joystick. But most famously, in 1996, when Nintendo introduced the Rumble Pack, a haptic feedback motor for the N64 controllers, making haptic vibration mainstream. But in 1996, when the Rumble Pack came out, it gave an idea to none other than Motorola, who at the time was working on their StarTAC phone. And this is the story of how the first vibration motor on a phone comes from. But before jumping into the next unlikely connection in tech, I need to tell you about the sponsor of this video, Vanta. If you're starting or scaling a company, building your product is what all your attention is on, and for good reason. But something that many founders overlook is security. And who blames them? Starting or scaling your business security is a headache, but this is exactly why Vanta manages this all for you.
Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2,
ISO 27001 and more, saving you time and money while you build trust with your customers. Your company's security reviews get easier with automated questionnaires, and you can demonstrate your security posture with Vanta Trust Center. Over 8,000 global companies use Vanta, and you can join them by clicking the link below or following the QR code on screen, which gets you $1,000 of Vanta. But let's get back to the video, because the next crazy connection is a story of how sometimes the biggest inventions come from people just being incredibly lazy. It's 1991 in the University of Cambridge, and the researchers there have a problem, a big one. The coffee pot where they get their coffee is in another room, and every time they need to go back and forth, only to sometimes discover the coffee is over. Any regular person would solve this by, I don't know, buying another coffee pot? But this is where you see the real power of lazy nerds. Because they realized that in order to solve this, they could place a camera and devise a way to stream the camera's feed over the newly invented internet to the computer they had in their room to monitor the coffee pot. And this is how the first webcam in history was born. So yeah, the reason I can be in Bali right now taking Zoom calls is because some nerds were feeling lazy. But as it turns out, sometimes even bad things can lead to something great, like a car crash. It's the year 2000. Backstreet Boys told us that they want it that way, and a guy named Elon Musk recently sold his first company, Zip2. So what does he do? What anyone would do. He buys a supercar, a McLaren F1, and he starts a new company that was supposed to revolutionize online banking, and he calls it X.com. Yeah, this is where the new name for Twitter comes from, by the way. But the company is competing fiercely with another company called Confinity. So Elon meets with the CEO of the other company, Peter Thiel, to find an agreement between the two companies. And to do so, he invites him to take a spin in his McLaren. So what can this thing do? Asks Peter. Watch this, says Elon. But seconds later, the car spun out of control, went flying off the street, and crashed. Miraculously, they both emerged from the car unharmed. They survived the crash, and they ended up going to the meeting they had with venture capitalist Michael Moritz on foot. And this is the moment where Confinity and X decided to merge and gave birth to a little thing called PayPal. And actually, the co-founders of YouTube met while working at PayPal. So had things gone different in that crash, I probably wouldn't even be here making this very video. So every day we tap and we click on things. We are so used to these. But have you ever stopped and wondered, what is the story behind these? Like this guy, the Google Maps pin. If you had to design a way to indicate something on a map, your first instinct would be to draw a small circle or a star, which is exactly what Yahoo Maps and old mapping applications were doing. But if you notice, this covers what's around the location. So when Google was making the first version of Google Maps, they were like, yoink. And now you can see what's around the location. And so the pin was born. And it became so iconic that it's literally the app's logo right now. The play pause button that we all use comes from old tape recorders. And it's actually just an arrow pointing in the direction of where the tape goes, from left to right. But the more interesting one is the pause button. Why the hell is it two rectangles? Well, because of this. This is a button on an old tape recorder, and it's the symbol of the tape head reading the tape, which is in the shape of two rectangles. And somehow the symbol, which comes from tape recorders, stuck around all the way to Spotify today. The power button. This one comes from engineering lore in the 1940s, where in binary 1 meant on and 0 meant off. So how do you design a button that can turn something both on and off? Well, look at that. And now let's go change some settings, which of course it's the gears. But why? Well, the function of a physical tool, a physical machine, and its settings were controlled back in the day by changing actual real gears. So that's what inspired the designers at Microsoft to design the first gear icon in history for the settings of Windows 95. And everyone was like, okay, this now is the global symbol for settings. But sometimes there are problems you just can't seem to solve until you stumble on a very unorthodox solution. It's weird, but it works. This is a wall of lava lamps, constantly being filled by a camera 24/7. Why? Well, this is an unorthodox solution to a very specific problem: making a computer generate random numbers. Computers are precise and deterministic machines, so making them spit out something that is truly random is actually a bigger problem than it seems. And it's especially a challenge for Cloudflare, a security firm that uses cryptography to keep a huge chunk of the internet secure. And they have a very specific need. They need a constant stream of truly random numbers to make the SSL TLS encryption on website work. And their solution? This, the Wall of Entropy. They film the lava lamps and they extract the RGB value from each pixel of the video stream. And given that the bubbles in the lava lamps move randomly, they now have a constant flow of random numbers to use for their algorithms. And this wall of lava lamps is what keeps a huge chunk of the internet secure. But have you ever come across a random number in the tech you use? A number that seems completely arbitrary and you wondered, why? Why did they choose this oddly specific number? For example, how many megabytes are in a gigabyte? What kind of question is that? Of course, everyone knows it's 1000 megabytes in a gigabyte. Metric system, baby. Sorry for my American audience. Well, 1000 is wrong, because in a gigabyte, there's actually 1024 megabytes. Why 1024? Why this seemingly random number? Because computers work in binary. And this means that you don't reason in powers of 10, like 10, 100, 1000, but in powers of 2. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. This is why a gigabyte is 1024 megabytes. Or why Pac-Man has 256 levels. Or why the maximum number of views a YouTube video can have before YouTube breaks is this number right here, which is a power of 2. And remember CDs? They allow to record a maximum of 74 minutes of audio. That's a weird limitation. Why? Well, because Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is 74 minutes long, and CDs were designed to fit that specific symphony inside them. So who makes the tech you use? Well, it's people, just like you and me. And people are weird. This is Excel 1997, and it's your average Excel, except for this guy that gives me crippling anxiety. But if you hit the right sequence of commands, you'll find that the developers of Excel 1997 hid a secret flying simulator inside the program, with the credits of the programmers that were working on it. Or Google Doodles, you know, the alternative logos they add to celebrate specific events. Well, this one from 1998 was the very first one. It's the stickman representing the Burning Man festival. And the founders of Google, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, added it to let people know that they were out of office because they were gonna get wasted at Burning Man. What you saw are all stories that hide behind the tech you use every single day. But there's a new story that is being written right now. And without knowing, you may also be a part of it. This is a story of how more and more people are getting fed up and they're starting to hate their smartphone. And so, what will happen in a world where smartphones are uncool? Well, you can learn all about it in this video right here. I'm Enrico, and I'll see you in the next one.